Good morning, all. I think everyone is joined the lobby and can hear me okay. Right, so welcome to our webinar around the LGR aspect. We're going to be doing convergence without chaos, bringing councils together safely. This is down for roughly about 45 minutes. What I'll try and do is I'll present for a period of time, and then at the end, if there's a Q&A session at the end as well. So hopefully you find this content useful for when you're transitioning through this period of time. But yeah, as I say, there will be questions at the end as well. So let me begin. So very quickly, we have the agenda, which is going to be looking at intros and welcomes, which I'll do in a moment, life after vesting, tenancy and collaboration strategies, data migrations and service configurations, and then what to standardize and what to leave alone. So from an introductions perspective, my name's Andy Wyatt. I am the head of digital workplace here at Trustmarque Ultima. I've been with the organization now for about 14 years, and I head up the technical pre-sales and delivery teams associated with the M365 stack. So this whole presentation is related to the Microsoft 365 stack and fundamentally around the tenancy migrations. So moving on, what's next for you guys as you're going through this process? So one of the things you'll know, and this shouldn't be new to all of you, that there's a government recommendation around the phasing approach. So again, currently going through phases 1 to 6. Now, the majority of the organizations on this call and one we're working with, they've had their decision confirmed. So you're fundamentally at a phase 2. Now, we've been working with organizations for the last 6 months in the phase 1 period, and I've really put this forward because there's already been a lot of information passed out. We've had a lot of conversations. The realization of the activities that need to be performed as part of this this phased approach is vast, and it's more around you can't see the wood for the trees. There's certain things you can do, certain things you can't do, certain things you need to focus on. So what I've put here is just more of a focus. So yes, there are 6 phases. Yes, we've already started doing phase 1 pre-decision and the activities and planning. Yes, we're moving into phase 2 and phase 3. But as a very focal point, so what's going to change when we hit vesting day? It is things like governance structures, organization responsibilities, shared services operating models, reporting lines, strategic priorities. What isn't going to change is things like the services you provide, the critical ones to residents, security requirements and controls, users and residents accessing, critical systems, operational processes that are working fine as they are. They don't need to change. And key business applications. You're not going to change them all on day 1. So what I wanted to do is really focus on the sort of key objectives of what you need to do at phase 4 going forward on this one. And that is looking at how can your staff work together, whether that's merged, separated organizations. We need to understand how can they do their job on day 1. The second piece is what services, services remain available, massively important, massively key on day 1, that the residents and public still have access to the services you're currently providing. Security is going to be key. Through these phases, it's a prime target for security breaches, malware, ransomware. This is where this element of change are going to get targeted. So you as organizations are going to be targeted due to this change that's being forced. So making sure that your data remains secure, that it is in control, that you're not reducing your security levels because of the process is going to be massively key as well. And obviously the last one is that the residents experience no or very little disruption. They're the fundamental 4 objectives you need to get to. There is a lot of information out there. There's a lot of things you need to do, which could take you and means that you lose that initial focus. So one of the things I'm going to be doing, talking about M365, is targeting that initial focus piece, looking at those 4 objectives, removing some of the clutter in the background and things that are nice to have and the things that you could do in the future, and really prioritizing what you need to do on day 1. So as I said, this is going to be around the Microsoft 365 question. So one of the things we've been dealing with already is what do we do about our current tenants? So we've been working with organizations where there's 3, 4, 5 tenants already. They're potentially going to have to merge together. Now, one of the things is there is no right tenancy model. Okay, there is a future state, a current state, and the bit in the middle. So the big question is, should your council consolidate into a single tenant, maintain multiple tenants, or operate a hybrid approach for a period of time? Now, if I'm being brutally honest, the answer is all three of them. You are going to phase in that. So you are going to be operating in a hybrid approach for a period of time. You are going to be looking at managing multi-tenants, even if it's for a short period of time. But there are aspects where you are going to have to move to a single tenancy. Now, looking at it from a day one, and again, it's not a day one decision, it is a long-term decision. Looking at it from a day one, yeah, there's massive benefits of going to a single tenancy. You know, from a user perspective, collaboration is going to be so much easier. You're all in the same area, you're all in the same, you know, groups, teams, security permissions. The governance around it means that you've got a standard set of governance. You're not having to say, well, we're using this function over on this tenancy and this function on this tenancy. Reducing of duplicating of data. I mean, you're going to have certain policies and procedures in one tenancy, in one organization, which are slightly different from the organization. And as a combined merged organization, which one best suits. So having that single tenancy is going to be so much easier, but there's a lot of pain to get to that. There's a lot of pain and a lot of work, and that isn't going to be something to be done in the next 12 months. Moving to a single tenancy and moving through those phases originally is going to be a multi-year engagement. That is what we're experiencing. Is what we've done with other merger and acquisitions outside of LGR, but it is going to be the best result in the end point. Now, benefits of a multi-tenancy, obviously day one, there's a lower impact from a migration risk. It gives you some political autonomy. There is an element of service separation. So again, you could theoretically say this element of the organization stays on that tenant because that was legacy X council. This can stay on one for another because that's legacy Y council. There's also a massive reduction on pressure from a delivery team for day one. I will talk a bit later about prioritization, about what you really need to focus on. But when you are looking at tenancy models going forward, there are some real key decisions that you need to make. And again, when we've spoken about it is, you know, there's certain elements where people have gone, well, we need to move to one tenant straight away. No, you don't. There are aspects you may need to move into centralize, but as a whole, most councils can collaborate effectively before completing a tenant's consolidation or migration. That's just fact. We do it all the time. There are going to be cross-trust areas. There's going to be, you know, cross-tenancy collaborations. And one of the things I put in there is technology should support the organizational change, not dictate it. So you need to make some key decisions. You know, for all the organization, for the councils I've already spoken to, and I've spoken to quite a few of these, we always push identity key first. Identity is the driver for everything, and I think we've already had a potential webinar on this already. It's massively important to get your identity decision done correctly and prioritized from day one, because everything is built off it, whether it is accessing systems data, whether it's putting accessing legacy data, whether it's making sure people can collaborate, whether it's controlling your devices, whether it's sharing data in OneDrive and Teams. Your identity is massively important. So some of the things you need to think about is, you know, as an organization, do you look to go for a single identity strategy? We've worked with ones that are using Okta, Entra ID, third party identity strategy pieces, making sure as an organization, as a now combined organization, you have that single long-term identity strategy is going to be massively important. Yes, Entra ID consolidation is an option down the line. How you're going to do that, where you're going to do that, again, brings into question of what you're going to prioritize going forward. Some real quick things that you can do quite easily is around shared service elements, around guest access approach, external access governance. They're the ones that are really going to support the cross-tenancy collaboration, which you're going to need to do. Again, following on from identity, collaboration is going to be the next area. Focusing on how your users are going to work on day one and afterwards is going to be key. That can be done through cross-tenant collaboration and configuration of that multi-tenant organization. Shared channels, prime example. Understanding how you're going to secure your file sharing, and again, what governance you're going to put around external access. That leads into security as well. So when you're thinking about one tenant, multi-tenant, agreeing a security posture is going to be massively important, and that is giving consistency around organizations and current tenants, whether that is, you know, your policy around MFA, whether that's conditional access and what you're doing, whether it's location, whether it's device, whether it's domain, your privilege, your PIM or your PAM and PIM accounts, where giving elevated access and privilege permissions. Monitoring and auditing is going to be massive as well, because as I said earlier, this change that you're having in your organization at the moment is a primary target for hackers and security breaches. So monitoring and auditing, if anything, needs to be elevated during that period to make sure you're not coming under attack. Now, this is all around whether you go one tenancy or multi-tenancy. This is even before you start thinking about your migration piece. But when you get to the point of, what should we do? How should we do it? I have put forward, sort of a 7-stage approach of how I would recommend looking at how you start with consolidating your work environment, your tenancies, looking at your migration pieces, and I think that assessment is key. We're already doing that with some organizations. We're already doing a tenancy assessment where you're understanding what you've got. You're looking at what's different between configurations. You're looking at how much data you've got in there. You're addressing okay, if it's from an easy perspective, would it be better to go to migrate everyone to tenant A or to tenant B, or is it best set up a greenfield site? That assessment piece where you're looking at each individual environment on their own, looking at the pros and cons, looking at their controls, looking at their content, looking at their user usage, that has to be done. Going into a decision whether you go single tenant, multi-tenant, primary tenant, secondary tenant, without knowing your data, is probably going to open you up to making an incorrect decision. So again, looking at things like the environment itself, the tenancy configuration, identity assessments, doing the security reviews, looking at application discovery, because again, if you've been using your M365 Entra ID as an authentication method for third-party SaaS systems, that needs to be taken into account. There's also legacy systems as well that need to be taken into account. That's always going to be in the assessment piece. As I then said, the secondary priority is going to be identity. So defining that target model, looking at things like duplicate accounts, naming conventions, how you're going to configure the cross-tenancy piece, and starting to enable federation across your Entra ID environments. Again, once you've got that identity piece set up, it really does mean that you can then start working a lot closer together, whether that is cross-tenancy, whether that's migrating to other tenancies. So after that, we start looking at collaboration, because again, one of the objectives is to make sure your users can do their job on day one. Now, if you've merged departments or you're merging departments, then processes are going to change, team members are going to change, collaboration is going to be massively key. You still don't want people working in silos after the merger on day one. You need them to start working collaboratively on the same goals, in the same processes. So understanding how they collaborate and potentially starting early around the collaboration piece is where you can start bringing things in around things like Teams Federation, looking at shared channels, looking at how your mail flow works, opening up things like calendar sharing quite early and address books. So again, there's different configurations and requirements that need to be met to support the collaboration piece, and it's understanding your strategy and what elements you can bring into play to support that collaboration area. Now, again, security is going to be massively important as well. So looking at things like, how do you standardize your conditional access policies? With conditional access, how do you open up your environment securely to the other accounts or domains? How can you then look at how the collaboration piece on that? What controls do you need to put into place? Again, I've talked about MFA standardization already, but there's things like defender aspects. You've got the suite of products within M365. You may have third-party solutions in place as well, but it's understanding now as a collective what's the chosen approach, what works best, and making sure we're aligned on that. So again, Intune standards, purview controls, all of that adds to the security levels of your data, your users, your devices, and you're basically interacting with M365. Now, all that is before you even think about migrating content. The first 4 stages really is just like, let's look what we can do, look where we can work from. Let's understand how we can start collaborating, but in a secure manner. Migrations now, yes. With any migrations, there's an easy way and there's a slightly more difficult way. The easy way isn't always the best way. So from our experience, you look at the sort of quick win migrations, and I've put a slight sequence in there. Exchange is going to be massively key from a migration perspective, especially if your new entity is having its own email domain, and I'll touch on this in a minute. Migrating it into an Exchange email is going to be probably the first step to improve that element of collaboration and that working together, making sure everyone's got the same email addresses, and those sort of things come into play. OneDrive is a quick follow. If you've done it properly, OneDrive is your own personal storage space rather than Teams or departmental storage. So looking at your OneDrive and doing a migration allows you to then start utilizing that functionality in that potential single tenancy. Exchange and OneDrive is also sort of prereq for getting the best out of Microsoft Teams, which is why Teams then comes into play as step 3. And then looking at your underlying SharePoint environments, and then fundamentally Power Platform at the end. So as an exchange, as a migration approach, that sort of sequence probably works best. There may be exceptions, but as a general rule, Exchange is more of a technical migration. OneDrive is more around a user migration. Teams again is user. So they're the 3 that I would prioritize very early on. SharePoint we can provide permissioning and connectivity into, and is probably a slightly lower priority. But I think the ones around the collaboration piece are going to be primary. Stage 6 is then look at endpoint. Once you've migrated, you can access M365 from a device that is controlled by another tenancy. That's fine. So understanding where your Intune and device and endpoint controls are in place. Yes, it's important to understand to make sure you standardize them, but you don't have to centralize them early. And then obviously, stage 7 is looking at the application piece. So again, depending on how we do identity, this will impact some of the single sign-ons, third parties, legacy, and all those pieces. Once you've stabilized your M365 environment, then looking to transition them across, because at the present moment, anything legacy is probably working Active Directory. Line of business might be through Entra, so there might be an element of Entra migration. But looking at the applications at the end of it is where you've already got that stability within your tenancy, the functionality in there, and then that means that at stage 7, that's more of a lower priority. What I've then done is I've gone into what is sort of the primary 6 areas and said, what should you really look at, and what are the common blockers that we sort of experience and see? So identity and authentication, I'm not going to go through all of this, but the common blockers you're going to see are things like duplicate user accounts across tenants, conflicting email addresses and UPNs, different identity providers, Active Directory dependencies, and the sort of application authentication against separate source tenants. So there are a lot of things we see. There are also a lot of things that we start planning with early. So it's not necessarily fixing the duplications, but it's understanding how we fix the duplications. There's a lot of areas we need to think about how we progress this through. So again, the areas of interest and to assess are the key areas within M365 that you need to look at to support a joined up tenancy, single tenancy, multi-tenancy. But again, they're sort of key around that. Now, when we go to email and exchange, again, a lot of people see this as quite a simple thing. It's email, it's calendars, it's meeting events. But under the back end element, there's a couple of general rules that might be big blockers. The biggest one is a domain can only exist on one tenant at a time. So if you are currently 3 or 4 tenants and you are merging and you have a new email domain, you can't have that email domain on all of the 3 and 4 tenants. It has to go on a single tenancy, which then means that any email has to be on that tenancy. So this is where some of the migration activities come into play, or things like mail routing or duplicate of accounts, or there's certain aspects you need to take into account when we're looking at things like this. Email is going to be key going forward. You may be releasing a new public facing email address, understanding where that lands within M365 or an Exchange, how your users are going to be accessing it, how can they send through that. That's all one of the big aspects and one of the first things we sort of need to look at as an early merger. or from vetting day one. It's not a simple decision because, again, if we move email to one tenant, then we need to look at the identity on that tenancy and how that's going to impact the users. Does that mean they have multiple identities? Do we put that trust in place? Do we migrate the identity to pieces? There are knock-on effects around that, which is why I said identity was already sort of key. But mail is typically the first thing we look at. Now, I've gone into Microsoft Teams as next one because of the collaboration environment. Areas to look at is, we all use Teams. Teams was rolled out massively through COVID, but half the time it wasn't set up, I want to say correctly, the most securely. It was done as a massive requirement getting it out through COVID phase. So this is now gives us an opportunity to look at that configuration, look at the architecture we had in place. The fact is, each one of the councils are going to have different ways of working within Microsoft Teams, whether that is departmental sites, collaboration sites, or whether that's a free-for-all. So things to look at is massively around within the assessment phase is looking at your Teams architecture, permissioning, redundant data, doing ROT analysis, how they're permissioned, what membership groups have we done, what are we doing around the configuration, what are we doing around the data that's behind that? Is some people using it for voice and telephony, or are we using another system? So looking at those sort of key areas around your teams is going to be important, especially from a merger and migration perspective. Is it better to then create new teams and migrate the content in? Is it better to migrate the teams? Again, it's a decision that needs to be made depending on the circumstances. Now, the biggest blocker on those is the dependency on Exchange and OneDrive. So currently, if you are working in your silo tenancy, your team works well because your Exchange and your OneDrive is on the same tenant. Now, if you move your Exchange and OneDrive to a new tenancy or a central tenancy, that's going to impact your team's experience. So again, taking that into account when we do the change and the migrations, which is why I've always said that those sort of three areas need to go 1, 2, 3. But understanding that impact to users, impact to functionality, going through that transitional phase is going to be really important. Now, the other thing with blockers is duplicates. Obviously, there's always a HR team somewhere. Every council has one, sub-teams and everything else. So again, understanding your strategy on how you're going to have those duplicate teams. Are you going to keep your legacy ones and spin up a new one? Or are you going to merge them? Again, this is all done through the assessment phase where we sort of make those decisions. Team ownership is always massively important because the person that created the team fundamentally may not be with the organization anymore. So having that ownership model in place and having either a default owner for that area or an agreed owner for that area is going to be massively important because we can apply that across. And again, Teams phone integration and shared channels limitations, understanding the ways of working and how you're going to transition from a hybrid, single tenancy approach through shared channels, through functionality is going to be the most common blockers. But a lot of that is around adoption and change management. Moving on, I said SharePoint is going to be one of the latter elements, but again, some of the considerations around sort of document management strategies and document lifecycle management needs to be taken into account of how you're going to be using OneDrive, how you're going to be using Teams, how you're going to be using SharePoint within your new organization. Is it for collaboration, document management, and personal storage? But when you're looking to migrate SharePoint, fundamentally, looking at the information architecture is going to be massively important. That's down to site structures, permissioning. It's going to be looked down to things like governance, retention, sensitivity labels, the metadata, site owners. So we've seen a lot where SharePoint environments are pretty, I'm going to say badly. Microsoft changed how they structure SharePoint when it went from on-prem to cloud. So a lot of organizations have adopted the old method in SharePoint Online, which probably isn't the best way. So we've seen a lot of poorly structured SharePoint environments, which is going to have an impact from a usability, a findability, an AI perspective. You start putting Copilot over the top. So when we do the assessment of the tenancies, we're looking at how those tenants are actually structured and saying, this is quite flat, this is quite structured, this is a bit all over the place. The biggest things you've got is things like, inconsistent permissions. Yes, how it's applied. Is it through groups? Is it through security groups? Is it applied directly? Inconsistency within an organization is going to be key, that one. Governance, again, is it's going to be a difficult one for yourselves because certain organizations have got the benefits of E5 and auto application of labels and retentions. Some are only using an E3 where it's all manually applied. How, as an organization, do you address that disparity in functionality? Because again, if we're looking to migrate content from one tenancy to another, we're going to go from an E5 tenancy into a centralized E3 tenancy. You're going to be losing functionality, and that might have an impact when it comes to the migration as well. And again, a lot of organizations do file SharePoint migrations quick and dirty, take file server to content, do as a lift and shift as is. That's always going to cause problems going forward. So again, something to take into account. I've already touched on some of the security and compliance and purview pieces, but again, it's going back to securing your data, making sure it's as secure as it can be within the environment and the licensing. But looking at things like what are we doing around sensitivity labels? Again, there are governance standards around this one as well. So if you've inherited them already, then that should be fine. DLP policies are going to be slightly different. Your retention schedules and controls and access and those sort of aspects, again, need to be consolidated going forward as part of that SharePoint move. But again, there's certain things we need to look at and certain blockers that can have a significant impact on the migration piece. And I've put some of them there. The last one around from a migration perspective is looking at the sort of device management and Intune. Now, there is a quite clean path around this, but it depends where you're going to be. So if you are typically using Intune on your tenancy, the likelihood is you're in a hybrid join state, which is managed within Intune, SCCM and group policies and those sort of things because of legacy systems. Now, from an Intune perspective, we need to understand where that device is enrolled. We then need to remove it from that old tenancy and move it to a new tenancy, applying the right level of controls and security around that. If you're considering autopilot, again, looking at that new image, that new build, that new control mechanism, where's that going to be coming from a tenancy perspective? And again, there's still going to be legacy domain dependencies, and also, one of the key ones is around shared devices. How we're going to deal with shared devices, moving tenants, is again one of the biggest blockers we've got around that. But again, if we're looking at if the device is already secured in its current tenancy, we can move a lot of the collaboration and user functionality to a new tenancy, yet retain the security device from your old tenancy. There is that element of transition, but again, it's more of a low priority. That's a very quick whistle-stop tour of the sort of technical considerations when it comes to migration within M365. One of the things I would also sort of consider before you even think about migrating content is sort of four key areas of consideration. The prime one, know what you've got before you decide where it goes. This is around, again, like I've already put there, data ownership, information governance, duplicate information, legacy systems. Having a clear understanding of what you've got in your environment before deciding where you're going to move it to, how you're going to use that data, what, cleansing you're going to be put into place. It's a real key element because, again, it will reduce efforts for migrations, because if you do sort of a ROT analysis on it, you're not going to be migrating all of the content. You're going to have clear ownership, clear structure in the new environment once you know where that data is coming from. So again, understanding what content and what data you've got in there is going to be massively important. Also, from a migration perspective, understanding service continuity. So we talked about some of the objectives around, making sure users do what day one, but key one is your, impact to the residents. What services can tolerate a level of downtime? Now, there are some services that might, some services that definitely can't. So understanding the impact of those services is key when it comes to the migration. Again, it goes into typically what are resident facing, which services around safeguarding and social care, what are your current recovery plans in place? So they are going to have to be a key consideration when you're looking at migrations. Because again, it can impact on the last point, which is around sequencing. The third point is, again, going back to security, retention and compliance. You sort of need to understand that you can't just do a lift and shift migration. You can't just migrate anything, because there is the element of security controls, that risk or threat you've got during that process. So again, you've also got some some obligations around freedom of information, subject access requests, and those pieces as well. So again, we need to look at retention and compliance in that area. The last point I've put in is around sequencing matters. And this is the bit where you really do have to take into account impact to users, impact to organization, not just a technical perspective. So avoid migrating everything all at once. A, technical nightmare. B, probably you don't have the technical capacity to do it. And C, your users are going to hate you for it. Because there's an element of acceptance of change. So within adoption change management, there's the change curve and the levels of adoption that your users can take. Within your industry, there are people that have been in the organization 30, 40 years that are probably slightly more resistant to change. You've got people coming in, straight out of university and those sort of aspects, which are more open to change and technology. So you have a massive variation in capability and digital literacy around M365. So understanding adoption change management is going to be massively important. So migrating everything is not a good idea. Multiple major changes, again, technically possible if you plan it correctly. From a user perspective, it's going to be far much more of a challenge, and the likelihood is that's going to cause more problems, increase the risk of security breaches and those sort of aspects because of the user side aspect of it. Large-scale user disruption, again, very similar. That's more a consequence of the other 2 points, but your users have to be key and have to lead the change program, not the IT project. There are certain things from an IT perspective we have to do, but if it's impacting a user, we need to understand the level of user disruption, their appetite for change, and how they can support change. So what we need to do is we need to consider prioritizing waves. So that is from a technical perspective, from a user perspective, migrate typically service by service. So let's not do big bang. Let's focus on service areas and migrate piecemeal. And then also look at it from a risk base. Again, whether that is security risk, whether that's user risk, that is access risk, downtime risk. Look at it from that risk sequencing. Now, the level of change that you're having to go through is going to be massive. It's going to be vast. It is going to be a multi-year change. So what we've sort of looked at and sort of thought about is, the saying of can't see the wood for the trees. That's the sort of level of change you're going through. So going for a much more simplistic approach to prioritize what you need to change and map your level of change might be the easiest thing to do to give you that level of focus. So I've put on there, so we talk about standardization. So each organization has different ways of working, different work technologies, different aspects of it. Simple question is, does the standardization reduce risk, improve user experience, or save money? That's 3 little criteria, and again, there's possibly more, and you can expand it out more depending on yourself. But that's sort of 3 focal points. Every piece of change, you can ask that level of question, and then you can map it against what values it brings into the organization and how much effort it is. So you can see from the sort of the graphic I've put up, high value, low effort could theoretically be very, very quick win and a prioritization. High value, large effort is more of a strategic priority. Doesn't mean it's not going to be something you start early, but it has to have a longer lead time. Anything where you've got medium value dependent on effort is something you need to look at, basically considering a latter phase, because your quick wins and your strategic priorities are going to take priority over those. And then anything of low value, depending on the effort, I wouldn't consider at the present moment. You need to focus on quick wins, strategic priorities, and then the aspects of consider later before you're doing that. Change has to bring value to your organization. If it doesn't, there's no point doing that level of change. Now, I've gone through a lot, and there's probably a lot more I could have gone through in this phase, but I'm limited on time. One of the last things I wanted to put up was the sort of Q&A and close. Now, there are questions when it comes to M365. There are questions that you as an organisation, you as councils, need to ask yourself. And that is, what should our strategy be? Which services can't be tolerated disruption? Do we understand our data estate? What security controls need to align first? And what should we deliberately leave alone? Now, I've just put a quote in there as well, that it's not a technical-led engagement. It's a managed journey. You need to look at this a long-term engagement and prioritize what you need to do for vetting day, and then what can actually happen later. We've had conversations with councils, and it's things like I can't remember what it was. I think we were talking about things like bin collection days, and how different councils have got different snippets of information and where they're going to go. And it's like, well, do we need to merge those all together? It's like, no, we don't. We just need to put something over the top and information around it. So there are ways of understanding that we can retain services without doing massive amounts of transformation. So the 3-step piece I've got is stabilize for day one. Focus on your primary objectives around that. Ensure that residents can access services, staff can work effectively from day one. Simplify where it matters. So again, focus on security, identity, and collaboration. And then transform later. So don't confuse convergence with transformation. We need to make sure that services continue potentially as is from day one. Transforming how everyone works in your council is not a day one activity. We need to retain that level of service. And I think that that's really where we need to focus and prioritize, because again, if we look at the big picture, if we look and try and achieve too much, we're not going to see the wood for the trees. We need to look at what do we have to do, because that time period between now and vetting day, we can only achieve so much within that period of time, and making sure we have that level of focus required to support that period of time is going to be massively important. Again, I could have gone through a lot more. I mean, I'm happy to open up to questions, again, because I think that's pretty much where we're at. Catherine, I don't know if you can open up if anyone has any questions around the sort of thing we've gone through. I will say, if you do have any direct questions around this, then I'm more than happy to accept them. So, Catherine, I don't know if you can share my email address. I don't have a problem with that when you say the show. So, again, if you want to contact me directly to discuss some of the high-level points I've covered, again, there is a lot of information I could have gone into detail on, but I'm more than happy to have that one-to-one conversation or smaller group conversation if needs be.